She had been told she was worth only the peace of a single winter, nothing more, nothing less, a debt paid in flesh rather than grain. What no one in that frozen village understood was that the man riding toward the exchange was investigating a conspiracy far older than her own rejection, and the moment he saw her kneeling in the snow, he knew this was never a deal he intended to complete. Before continuing, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Snow fell over Grey Hollow like it had somewhere else to be, drifting past shuttered windows and frozen well ropes, settling on rooftops that hadn't seen a warm meal in weeks. Inside the storehouse, Evelyn Ashford knelt on the cold stone floor, fingers numb around a stub of charcoal, cross-checking the grain tallies against last month's numbers for the third time that night. The totals didn't match, not by a little, by enough that someone would have noticed the shortfall months ago if they'd bothered to look, enough that entire sacks of stored wheat seemed to have simply stopped existing between one entry and the next. Evelyn flipped back through older ledgers with growing unease, tracing the discrepancy further and further into the past, until she found the exact week it began, 3 months back, right around the time the elders had started meeting behind closed doors more frequently than usual. Someone was stealing from a starving village, and whoever it was had known exactly how to hide it from everyone except the one person who actually read the numbers. She brought her findings to Elder Whitlock the next morning, expecting concern, maybe even gratitude for catching what nobody else had. Instead, she got silence, a long, uncomfortable pause where his eyes flicked toward the door before settling back on her with something that looked uncomfortably close to calculation. "You'll keep this to yourself," he said finally, "not a request. The council is already aware." Evelyn's stomach turned cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. Already aware meant they'd known and said nothing, which meant either they were protecting someone or they didn't want the village asking questions about where their food had actually gone. She opened her mouth to press further, and Whitlock cut her off with a look sharp enough to end the conversation entirely. "There's a council meeting tonight," he added, already turning away. "Your presence has been requested." The way he said it made it sound less like an invitation and more like a sentence already passed. The council hall smelled of tallow smoke and fear, thick enough to taste, candlelight throwing long shadows across faces that wouldn't meet each other's eyes, let alone hers. Harold stood near the fire when Evelyn arrived, and the first thing she noticed was that nobody had brought up the missing grain at all. Not once, not even in passing. Instead, Harold cleared his throat and announced, with the practiced steadiness of a man reciting lines he didn't believe, that the thieves controlling the eastern roads had offered a trade, one villager in exchange for safe passage through the winter. "It's the only way to guarantee the food we have left actually reaches people," he said, and something about the phrasing snagged in Evelyn's mind even through her shock. Reaches people, as though he were already anticipating losses that had nothing to do with bandits. Nobody argued. Nobody asked why the timing lined up so precisely with a theft the council had apparently known about for weeks. Evelyn watched her own father avoid her eyes and understood, with sudden and sickening clarity, that she wasn't being offered as a sacrifice for the village's survival. She was being offered as a way to make an inconvenient problem disappear before anyone started asking who'd really been eating the missing grain. She didn't cry. She catalogued instead, the way Margaret's hand found Harold's arm a half-second too eager, the way two elders exchanged a glance loaded with something closer to relief than grief, the way nobody once mentioned the tampered ledgers sitting in the storehouse exactly where she'd left them. A messenger stood near the door throughout the entire meeting, young and visibly uncomfortable, one hand pressed against a folded parchment tucked inside his coat, like it mattered more than anything being said aloud. Evelyn filed that detail away too, the way she filed everything, even as the room around her quietly finished deciding her fate without ever asking for her voice in it. If they wanted her gone badly enough to trade her for bandit silence, then someone in that hall had far more to lose from her ledgers than they were willing to admit. She just didn't yet know who. Dawn came grey and merciless, and the cart was waiting before she'd finished dressing, 2 armed men flanking it with the bored efficiency of an errand, rather than an execution. Villagers lined the path without meeting her eyes, and Evelyn climbed into the cart herself, spine straight, refusing to give any of them the satisfaction of watching her break. An hour into the ride, snow swallowing the wheel ruts behind them, she noticed something the guards clearly hadn't. A second set of tracks running parallel to the road, too even, too deliberate to belong to wild animals, the kind of tracks left by riders moving with practiced discipline just beyond the tree line. She said nothing, watching instead as the younger guard leaned toward the older one and murmured something too quiet to fully catch. The older guard's jaw tightened. Without explanation, he wrenched the reins hard to the left, forcing the cart onto a narrower, less direct route through the trees. Evelyn gripped the cart's edge as it lurched over the uneven ground, pulse hammering, trying to piece together what she'd just witnessed. "Why are we changing course?" she asked, and for a moment neither guard answered, the silence stretching taut enough to hurt. Finally, the older one glanced toward the tree line, toward those same disciplined tracks she'd already noticed, and muttered something under his breath, more to himself than to her. Let's hope they haven't arrived yet. Evelyn's mind raced through possibilities. The thieves, arriving early to claim their payment before the agreed meeting point? Soldiers, sent by some rival faction to intercept the trade? Or something else entirely? Something the guards feared more than bandits and weren't willing to name aloud. She didn't understand who they were, but watching two armed men grow visibly nervous over tracks in the snow told her more than the entire council meeting had. Whatever was happening here reached far beyond a simple trade for winter safety, and she was riding directly into the middle of it, with no idea which side, if any, actually wanted her alive. E ao mesmo tempo, a alguns quilômetros dali, Lucian Blackthorne já vinha rastreando algo próprio havia semanas. Uma série de ataques a caravanas ao longo da fronteira leste, coordenados com uma precisão que não tinha cheiro de banditismo comum. Alguém da região estava vazando rotas, horários, cargas. Quando um de seus batedores relata um carrinho de escolta se desviando repentinamente para uma trilha restrita, uma rota que, segundo seus próprios mapas, não deveria estar sendo usada por ninguém sem autorização, Lucian sabe, antes mesmo de ver Evelyn, que aquilo não é uma coincidência. É a peça que faltava. The ravine appeared after hours of silent travel, jagged rock walls rising on either side like the jaws of something ancient, swallowing what little daylight the winter sky offered. Evelyn sat rigid in the cart, cataloguing details out of habit more than hope. The thinness of the horses waiting ahead, the mismatched boots on the men guarding the rocks, a faded crest scratched deliberately off the hilt of a sword one of them carried. Common bandits didn't bother erasing crests. Common bandits didn't march in such disciplined rows either, spacing themselves with the kind of precision she'd only ever seen in trained soldiers, not desperate thieves surviving off stolen grain. Something about this entire arrangement felt wrong in a way she couldn't yet name, and that unease sharpened when a broad-shouldered man stepped forward from the group, his smile arriving a full second before his eyes did. "Garrick," one of her escorts muttered, low enough that Evelyn barely caught it, and something in the way he said the name told her this man's reputation wasn't built on mercy. Garrick approached with unhurried, almost courteous steps, studying the paperwork one of her guards handed over with theatrical care, as though this were a land deal rather than a trade of a human life. "Everything in order," he said pleasantly, folding the document and tucking it away. "Bring her out, then." Evelyn's guards helped her down from the cart, her boots sinking into fresh snow, and for one long, suspended moment, she genuinely believed this was how it would end. Traded away in a frozen ravine to a man who smiled too easily. Garrick circled her slowly, assessing, until his gaze snagged on the ink staining her fingertips, faint but unmistakable even in the grey light. "You read," he said, not a question. "Right, too, I'd wager." Evelyn kept her chin level, refusing to flinch. "Why does that matter?" Garrick's smile widened, slow and unsettling. "Because a girl who can read ledgers is worth considerably more than a girl who can't." He turned toward his men, already recalculating terms, already treating her like inventory rather than a person. And that was the exact moment the forest around them went utterly, unnaturally still. Riders emerged from the tree line without warning, without shouted commands, simply materializing from shadow and snow with the discipline of men who'd surrounded 100 clearings before this one. Garrick's men froze mid-motion, weapons half raised before uncertainty stopped them entirely, eyes darting toward the ridge with the particular alertness of survivors recognizing a threat they couldn't outfight. The man who dismounted at the front moved without wasted motion, dark hair damp with melting snow, storm-grey eyes sweeping the clearing once before settling on Evelyn with an attention that made her breath catch for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. "Blackthorn!" Someone near her breathed, reverent and terrified in equal measure, and Evelyn finally understood why the entire ravine had gone quiet, why even Garrick's easy smile had thinned into something far more careful. Lucian didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Someone here," he said, each word landing with unhurried weight. "Forgot whose land this is." The temperature in the clearing seemed to drop several degrees further, though nothing about the weather had actually changed. Garrick recovered his composure quicker than most men would have, spreading his hands in a gesture of exaggerated reasonableness. "A simple trade, Your Grace. Nothing that concerns the crown." Lucian's gaze didn't waver from him. "A human life traded on my roads concerns me a great deal." Beside him, Rowan leaned close enough for only Lucian to hear, though Evelyn, closer than either of them realized, caught the words anyway. "Third cart on this route in 2 weeks. Same pattern as the caravan losses near the Eastern Pass." Lucian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, some private calculation finally clicking into place. "I suspected someone was negotiating with them," he said quietly, and Evelyn felt something shift in her understanding of him entirely. He hadn't arrived by chance, hadn't simply been riding past. He'd been hunting this pattern for weeks, and her cart had just confirmed something he'd long suspected. Garrick, sensing the shift in the air, tried once more, his smile never faltering even as his voice thinned with strain. "I always hate negotiating for children," he said lightly, glancing at Evelyn like she were something small and disposable. "But they tend to be the cheapest payment available." The words landed cold and deliberate, and Evelyn watched Lucian's expression go very still in response. What happened next unfolded with brutal efficiency. Lucian's men closing the distance without a single blow exchanged, Garrick's forces retreating toward the tree line with the swift calculation of men who understood precisely when a fight wasn't worth having. Garrick himself lingered a moment too long, and in his hurry to abandon the exchange, a leather satchel slipped from his coat, spilling documents across the trampled snow. Rowan crouched to gather them before they scattered further, sorting quickly through trade agreements and shipping manifests, until his hands stilled on a single folded page bearing a wax seal pressed deep into faded crimson. He rose slowly, crossing to Lucian without a word, holding the page out between them. Lucian took it, and Evelyn, still close enough to watch, saw something rare cross his face as his eyes settled on the seal itself. Not confusion, not anger, but genuine, unguarded shock. His fingers tightened slightly around the parchment's edge. "Impossible," Lucian said, quiet enough that the word nearly vanished into the snow-muffled silence of the ravine. He didn't explain. He didn't move for several long seconds, his eyes fixed on that single crimson seal, as though it had rewritten something he'd believed settled years ago. Evelyn watched him, watched the careful control slip for just a heartbeat, before he folded the page and tucked it away, his expression smoothing back into practiced composure. He turned toward her then, and whatever storm had passed behind his eyes gave way to something quieter, more deliberate. "You're safe," he said, and this time there was no hesitation in his voice at all, only certainty, and beneath it, something that sounded almost like relief that surprised even him. Evelyn opened her mouth to ask about the seal, about the word impossible, about whatever truth had just rearranged itself in front of her, but Lucian was already turning toward his horse, already burying whatever he'd just discovered somewhere she couldn't yet reach. Castle Blackthorn rose out of the snow like something carved rather than built, dark stone disappearing into low winter clouds, and Evelyn stepped through its gates still half convinced this was temporary, a few days to give testimony before being sent back to whatever remained of her old life. The kitchen argument found her within the hour, 2 stewards raising their voices over stores that didn't add up, and when Evelyn offered to look at the ledgers herself, the older one gave a short, humorless laugh. "This isn't village bookkeeping, girl. These are royal accounts." He said it like a door closing, like her offer had been an overstep rather than help. Evelyn held his gaze without flinching, the same steadiness that had kept her upright in a council hall that decided her worth without asking. "Then it should be easy for me to be wrong," she said quietly, and something about her calm unsettled him more than an argument would have. He gestured toward the storeroom with visible reluctance. muttering that she was welcome to waste her evening if she wanted to. She didn't solve it in an hour. She found one error first, a shipment logged twice under different dates, and nearly dismissed it as simple carelessness, until a second discrepancy surfaced an hour later, then a third, each one small enough to explain away individually, but impossible to ignore once stacked together. Evelyn worked the way she always had, absently arranging the scattered quills and inkpots into neat, exact rows as she thought, a habit she'd never noticed in herself until Benedict, watching from the doorway, pointed it out with quiet amusement. "You do that when you're close to something," he said, and Evelyn glanced down at the tidy line of quills, startled that a stranger had learned that about her faster than her own family ever had. By midnight she had her answer. Every falsified entry led back to a single signature, buried carefully enough that whoever forged it clearly believed no one would ever cross-reference 3 years of records by hand. Benedict stared at her work for a long moment, then let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "I've been chasing this exact discrepancy for 30 years, he said, shaking his head. 30 years, and a girl half my age finds it in one night." Something in his voice cracked with something warmer than surprise, and Evelyn felt for the first time in longer than she could remember, genuinely seen. Word spread faster than she expected, and 2 days later she found herself standing before 5 senior administrators who'd gathered specifically to dispute her findings, each one certain his own numbers were correct, voices overlapping in a room thick with wounded pride. "Who authorized a peasant girl to handle royal ledgers at all?" one of them said, not quite to her, loud enough to make sure she heard it anyway. Evelyn said nothing. She simply picked up a stub of charcoal, drew 3 quick calculations across a spare parchment, and set it down in the center of the table without a word. Silence spread through the room, as each administrator checked his own figures against hers, and one by one, their protests died in their throats. From the doorway, unnoticed until that exact moment, Lucian had been watching the entire exchange without a word. Rowan, standing beside him, murmured just low enough for his king to hear, "Why don't you go in?" Lucian's eyes stayed fixed on Evelyn, steady and unreadable. "Because she still believes she has something left to prove," he said quietly, and didn't move from the doorway, even after the room began to empty. He found a reason to speak with her later that evening anyway, appearing in the archive with a book he claimed needed returning, though Evelyn suspected, correctly, that the errand was invented. Their hands brushed as she took it from him, brief and accidental, and she continued speaking as though nothing had happened while Lucian, for just a moment, seemed to forget entirely what he'd meant to say next. "Who taught you to read numbers like that?" he asked instead, recovering, watching her with an intensity that made her want to look away and refuse to at the same time. "No one," Evelyn admitted, surprised by the honesty of her own answer. "I just started noticing when things didn't sound right. Sacks that felt lighter than the count. Silences that lasted a beat too long when someone lied about a harvest. She hadn't told anyone that before, not even her father." Lucian studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes that looked almost like recognition, like he'd just found a piece of himself in someone he hadn't expected to understand him at all. "That's rarer than talent," he said finally. "That's instinct. It can't be taught." Rowan chose that exact moment to appear in the archway, a folded report in hand, breaking whatever fragile thing had been building between them. He handed it to Lucian without a word. Lucian read it in silence, his jaw tightening, then closed it and tucked it away without offering a single explanation, though his gaze flicked toward Evelyn just once before he left, as though whatever Rowan had uncovered somehow involved her too. The theft happened that same night, though Evelyn sensed it before anyone confirmed it. She walked into the recovered storeroom the next morning, stopped in the doorway, and went completely still. Benedict, following behind her, asked what was wrong. "There's a row missing," she said, before anyone else had even noticed the shelves looked different. The staff crowded in behind her, scanning the same shelves, seeing nothing but organized stacks of grain sacks, until Evelyn pointed to the exact gap in the pattern, a space 3 sacks wide where the stacking rhythm broke, invisible to anyone who hadn't spent hours memorizing its shape the night before. Only then did someone check the ledger and confirm an entire shipment gone, vanished sometime after the household had gone to sleep, taken by someone who clearly knew the storeroom's layout as intimately as she now did. Evelyn stared at that gap, cold recognition settling over her. the same feeling she'd had staring at Grey Hollow's tampered ledgers months ago. This wasn't random, and it wasn't the first time. She was still staring when Lucian arrived, drawn by the commotion, and something in his expression told her Rowan's earlier report had already prepared him for exactly this. Evelyn crossed to the emptied shelf and crouched near a splintered crate left behind in the theft's haste, brushing away a thin layer of frost until a mark carved into the wood caught the torchlight. A symbol, small and deliberate, identical to the one pressed into the wax seal Lucian had gone silent over in that frozen ravine. She didn't need to say anything. She simply pointed. Lucian crossed the room in 3 strides, crouched beside her, and went utterly still, his eyes fixed on that carved mark, like it had rewritten every assumption he'd built since the negotiation. For the first time since she'd known him, the Alpha King's composure cracked completely, something raw and dangerous flickering behind his eyes before he stood, turned toward Rowan, and spoke in a voice that left no room for questions. "Close the castle." Nobody explained what "close the castle" meant until the gates groaned shut behind them, guards doubling at every entrance, servants exchanging uneasy glances as whispers of betrayal spread faster than anyone could contain them. Evelyn wasn't summoned to Lucian's council that morning. She wasn't nobility, wasn't anyone with official standing in a castle under lockdown. But when Rowan found her in the archive an hour later, he didn't ask if she wanted to help. He simply set a stack of shipping manifests in front of her. "His Grace wants your eyes on these," he said, and the careful way he said it told her exactly how unprecedented that request actually was. She worked through them methodically, tracing delivery routes against theft dates, until a pattern emerged too precise to be coincidence. Every stolen shipment funneled through the same stretch of eastern corridor, regardless of where it originated. "They're not stealing randomly," she said aloud, more to herself than anyone. Benedict leaned over the map, uneasy. "Then what are they doing?" Evelyn didn't answer yet. She was still tracing the shape of something she wasn't ready to say. The symbol consumed her focus after that. The same mark carved into the crate, matching the seal from the ravine. 2 days of cross-referencing produced 6 more crates bearing it, each carved subtly enough to escape notice, unless someone was specifically hunting for it. Lucian granted her access to the restricted archives without hesitation, overruling an advisor who protested that a commoner shouldn't handle sealed records. "She's found more in 4 days than this castle managed in a year," he said flatly, ending the argument before it began. Working alone that night, Evelyn uncovered a decades-old survey referencing a forgotten passage, a tunnel connecting the storehouses to the outer walls, sealed off generations ago and apparently never fully decommissioned. She stared at the parchment as the pieces settled into place. The thief hadn't needed to sneak past guards at all. He'd simply walked beneath them. She went to find the tunnel's entrance herself before dawn, lantern shielded, boots silent against packed earth as she descended stone steps no one had used in years. Recent footprints marked the dust ahead of her, and further in, a torch bracket still held warmth against her fingers, someone having passed through mere minutes before her arrival. Then came voices, low, unhurried, drifting from a side passage she hadn't yet explored. Evelyn extinguished her lantern instantly, pressing herself into a recessed alcove, heart hammering as footsteps grew closer. 2 figures passed within arm's reach, cloaked, faces lost to shadow, and all she caught in the brief sliver of torchlight was a pair of worn leather boots, and on one hand, a signet ring catching the light for half a second before vanishing again into darkness. She didn't move for several long minutes after they'd gone, replaying that fragment of gold and shadow, understanding with cold clarity that she'd just come within feet of whoever was orchestrating all of this, and had absolutely no way to prove it. She brought Lucian to the tunnel entrance that afternoon, spreading the old survey between them by torchlight. He studied the route in silence, tracing it with one finger, and stopped abruptly at a point Evelyn hadn't fully considered. "This passes directly beneath the old arsenal," he said, something sharpening in his voice. "Nobody's used that armory in a decade, which means nobody's checked it in a decade either." Evelyn looked up at him, genuinely startled by how quickly he'd seen what she'd nearly missed. "You found that faster than I did." A faint, unfamiliar warmth touched his expression. "You keep saying things like that as though it should surprise you." The space between them felt suddenly narrow, charged with something neither of them named, and for a moment, Lucian simply looked at her, too long, too openly, before catching himself and stepping back, putting deliberate distance between them with the discipline of a man reminding himself of exactly where he stood. The council convened that evening to review what little they'd confirmed, and one of the elder advisers, Lord Ashby, made no effort to hide his skepticism when Evelyn was invited to speak. "Curious," he said, addressing the room rather than her, "how every disaster in this castle seems to trace back to the moment she arrived." The insinuation landed exactly as intended, and Evelyn felt the weight of every eye in the room shift toward her, waiting to see how she'd defend herself. She didn't get the chance to. Lucian's voice cut through the silence before she could speak, quiet and absolute. "From today," he said, looking directly at Ashby, "she enters any room I enter." Nobody argued. Nobody dared. It wasn't affection dressed up as policy. It was authority, granted plainly and completely, and every person in that hall understood exactly what it meant. Rowan delivered his findings shortly after, more measured than Evelyn expected. The falsified signatures traced back to the council's own official seal, one reported stolen months ago and never recovered, narrowing their suspects to 4 men with access to it. Cedric among them, but far from confirmed. She returned to her quarters near midnight, exhausted, and didn't notice anything wrong until she was halfway through undressing. A faint draft from the window she was certain she'd latched. Evelyn froze, scanning the room, and found her desk disturbed. Papers shifted just slightly from where she'd left them. Everything appeared present at first glance. It wasn't until she counted through the stack twice that she understood what was actually missing. Not the theft records, not her notes on the symbol, but the single hand-drawn copy of the tunnel map, the one piece of evidence that proved exactly what she knew and how much of it she'd already pieced together. Evelyn stood very still in the center of her room, the open window curtain stirring faintly in the draught, and felt the entire shape of the situation invert itself in her mind. The intruder hadn't come searching for information. He'd come to confirm precisely how much she already had, which meant she had stopped being merely an investigator somewhere in the last few days and had quietly, dangerously, become a target instead. Evelyn didn't sleep again that night, sitting instead with her back against the door, replaying the missing map, the ring in the tunnel, the careful timing of a theft designed to look like carelessness rather than what it actually was, a message. By morning she'd stopped waiting to be protected and started thinking like the person who'd once cornered her own family's lies back in Grey Hollow. She found Lucian before he'd finished dressing, breathless, laying out a plan that made Rowan visibly tense the moment she finished explaining it. "Let a marked shipment go through untouched," she said. "Normal route, normal guards, except we control exactly who knows where it's headed." Rowan shook his head immediately. "If we're wrong, we lose the last of the winter reserves for nothing." A commander muttered that risking the stores on a hunch bordered on reckless, and even Benedict, usually gentle in his disagreements, warned that if this failed, it would be Evelyn's name attached to the disaster, not the Crown's. Lucian listened to every objection without interrupting, then looked at Evelyn for a long moment before turning to the room. "We do it her way," he said, and the weight of overruling his entire council for a girl who'd been in his castle barely a month settled visibly over everyone present. The waiting stretched 3 unbearable days. Evelyn stationed in a hidden alcove overlooking the eastern corridor, while every nerve in her body screamed to intervene early. She thought more than once of Lord Ashby's voice in council, curious how every disaster traces back to the moment she arrived, and the memory sharpened rather than dulled her focus, a debt she intended to collect properly. On the 3rd night, movement finally came, a lone figure slipping toward the marked crate with the same practiced confidence she remembered from the tunnel. Torchlight caught his face fully as he reached for it, and the shape of everything she'd suspected collapsed into something worse than she'd imagined. Not Cedric, but Ashby himself, the advisor who'd spent weeks questioning her loyalty in open council while quietly orchestrating the very crimes he'd accused her of enabling. He froze for half a second, then bolted, abandoning the crate and sprinting straight for the tunnel entrance rather than surrender. He nearly made it. Ashby tore through the passage with the desperation of a man who understood exactly what capture would cost him, stopping only long enough to hurl a satchel of documents into a lantern flame, watching evidence curl to ash before turning to flee again. Evelyn's tracker lost him twice in the tunnel's branching dark, and for several agonizing minutes it seemed entirely possible he'd vanish into the night the way he'd operated for years. Unseen, untouchable, one step ahead of everyone who should have caught him sooner. He burst from the tunnel's far exit near the stables, already reaching for a saddled horse he must have arranged in advance, and skidded to a halt only when a figure stepped calmly into his path, sword already drawn, saying nothing at all. Lucian didn't shout. He didn't need to. He simply stood between Ashby and the open stable door, blade steady, until the older man's shoulders dropped in the specific defeated way of someone finally understanding there was no version of tonight where he walked free. The great hall filled by mourning, nobles gathering in stunned rows as Lucian laid out weeks of evidence Evelyn had assembled piece by piece, the falsified ledgers, the tunnel beneath the old arsenal, the stolen council seal Ashby had used to forge years of quiet theft. The room went utterly silent when the final piece was read aloud, that silence somehow louder than any outcry could have been, broken only by a servant near the back who began quietly crying with relief, having suspected Ashby's cruelty for years, without anyone willing to listen. Cedric, cleared entirely, caught Evelyn's eye across the hall and gave a small, grateful nod. Ashby said nothing throughout the entire proceeding, and when the sentence was finally pronounced, the silence that followed felt less like an ending and more like the whole castle exhaling at once. News reached Grey Hollow within the week. Harold arrived at the castle gates 4 days later, Margaret trailing uncertainly behind him, both looking smaller than Evelyn remembered. His eyes caught briefly on the small blackthorn crest now pinned at her collar, and something in his expression shifted. Quiet understanding, unspoken, that his daughter had found a place that valued her in ways Grey Hollow never had. "We were wrong," he said. Evelyn studied him and found only quiet distance where she'd once expected an ache. "You were," she agreed simply, offering nothing more. Margaret opened her mouth, something between an apology and an excuse rising in her throat, but Evelyn was already turning away. "You don't decide who I am anymore," she said, not unkindly, and walked on before either of them could answer. That evening, crossing the courtyard toward the eastern wall, Evelyn noticed something she hadn't before, soldiers straightening as she passed, a pair of stable hands pausing their work entirely to nod in her direction, small gestures of respect that had nothing to do with Lucian's favor and everything to do with what she'd earned on her own. She found him waiting on the wall, watching the same horizon she'd once stared at, feeling like nothing but discarded weight. "Your father came a long way to say very little," he said, and Evelyn allowed herself a tired laugh. Lucian turned to her then, something unguarded in his expression, and drew a small, worn case from inside his coat, pressing it into her hands without opening it. "Keep this until tomorrow," he said, quiet enough that the wind nearly took the words. Evelyn turned it over once in her palm, feeling some faint weight shift inside, unable to guess whether it held a title, an invitation to his council, or something far more personal. "That's not an answer," she said. Lucian's eyes held hers a moment too long before he finally looked away toward the darkening hills. "No," he agreed. "It isn't. Not yet." Morning came pale and clear, the first truly cloudless sky since Evelyn had arrived at Castle Blackthorn, and she woke with the small, worn case still resting on her nightstand, exactly where she'd left it, unopened. A servant arrived at mid-morning, summoning her to the great hall to give final testimony on the Ashby affair, or so the message claimed. Evelyn dressed, expecting another round of questions from the council. Nothing more, though some quieter part of her refused to fully believe that explanation. She tucked the case into her sleeve out of habit rather than plan, unwilling to leave it behind, and made her way through corridors that had stopped feeling foreign weeks ago, without her quite noticing when the shift happened. The great hall stood fuller than she'd ever seen it, and the moment she stepped through the doors, Evelyn understood this was no ordinary testimony. Lucian remained seated as she approached, unreadable, while a cluster of older nobles near the dais spoke in low, tense voices that quieted only when she drew close enough to hear the tail end of one lord's protest. "A commoner has never held a seat on this council," the man said, not troubling to lower his voice further, "and I'd remind his grace that tradition exists for reasons stronger than sentiment." Evelyn kept her spine straight, refusing to let the words land visibly, though her pulse had already quickened with the particular sting of being discussed, as though she weren't standing close enough to hear it. Lucian rose slowly from his seat, and the hall fell silent in the specific way rooms did when he chose to speak. "Then today," he said, holding the noble's gaze without a trace of hesitation, "will be the first time." He turned to address the full court then, and Evelyn realized only as he began that she'd expected another crisis, another problem needing her particular attention. "Not this. 3 months ago," Lucian said, "a cart arrived at my borders, carrying a girl this kingdom had never asked to see and never bothered to notice." Evelyn felt the weight of the entire hall settle on her, and this time she didn't look away from it. "When everyone else saw a burden," he continued, his gaze finding hers directly now, the formality of the speech falling away into something plainer, more exposed, "I saw someone who'd been carrying an entire kingdom's worth of competence without anyone thinking to ask her name." A ripple moved through the crowd, something between surprise and quiet recalculation. He extended his hand toward her, not a command, an invitation, and Evelyn crossed the remaining distance without a single moment's hesitation, climbing the dais steps beside him with a steadiness that would have been unimaginable to the girl who'd once stood silent in her father's council hall, waiting to learn what she was worth. "Evelyn Ashford," Lucian said, voice carrying easily through the hall, "I name you head of this kingdom's council of logistics and provisions, with full authority over its stores, its trade routes, and its defenses against exactly the corruption you were the first to uncover." The stunned murmur that followed carried an undercurrent of resistance from a handful of the older lords, but it died quickly beneath the sound of something else spreading through the hall entirely. Soldiers along the back wall striking fists to their chests in a slow, spontaneous show of respect. Kitchen staff crowded near a side entrance, grinning openly, Benedict dabbing at his eyes with badly disguised emotion, while Rowan, arms crossed near the dais, allowed himself the faintest, satisfied smile. Evelyn looked out over all of it, this room built from the same architecture of judgment that had once decided her worthlessness without asking, and felt it finally, completely transform into something else. Lucian stepped closer once the formal announcement settled, closer than protocol strictly allowed, and reached for her hand in front of the entire court without hesitation. "I trusted you," he said, quiet now, meant for her more than the room, "before I fully understood why. I understand it now." His fingers closed around hers, warm despite the hall's lingering winter chill, and Evelyn felt something settle deep in her chest. Not relief, but recognition, the particular ache of being seen completely by someone who'd chosen to look past every reason the world had handed him to overlook her. Far beyond the castle walls, though neither of them could see it, Harold stood at the edge of a hill overlooking Blackthorn's banners, freshly raised in the new councillor's honour, and said nothing at all, understanding in that silence everything his own silence had once cost him. The hall emptied slowly, nobles and servants alike drifting out until only the two of them remained beneath the tall windows, snow drifting silently past the glass in the fading afternoon light. Evelyn finally drew the small case from her sleeve, turning it over once before opening it, and found inside an old iron seal, its edges worn smooth by decades of handling, engraved with a sigil she didn't recognize, but somehow understood the weight of immediately. "It belonged to the woman who founded that council you now lead," Lucian said quietly, watching her study it. "She saved this kingdom once, generations ago, without ever lifting a sword." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped into something private, meant only for the empty hall and the two of them standing in it. "Now it belongs to the second. Under that same pale moon that once watched a girl handed away like unwanted cargo, Evelyn Ashford now stood as something no one in Grey Hollow had ever imagined possible, chosen, not discarded, seen fully by a king who'd looked past every reason the world gave him to overlook her. Somewhere in that transformation lives a question worth sitting with. How many of us have felt invisible in rooms that decided our worth without ever asking? How many have quietly wondered if we'd ever be truly chosen, rather than simply tolerated? Evelyn's story is proof that even hearts hardened by duty and solitude can learn to see clearly, and that sometimes the people the world discards are exactly the ones destiny has been waiting for all along. If her story stayed with you tonight, if some quiet part of you recognized that ache of feeling unseen, or dared to hope for a love that finally chooses you back, then know that under this same moon there are still more stories waiting, more alpha kings, more forbidden bonds, more women who were never supposed to matter and did anyway. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and come back soon, because this world of dark fantasy and unbreakable devotion is only just getting started.